Hello, I'm John David Ebert, and welcome to the second half of our discussion of the oeuvre of Damien Hirst. We're almost about midway in his career here, and we're looking at the images of his works. Long about 1994, he produced a series of surgical vitrines called Still, Naked, and Doubt. There were three of them. This one here is Naked, and this one here is Still. And essentially, these vitrines correspond to his medicine cabinets. And whereas the medicine cabinets there imagined the human body as a chemical assemblage of components that could be swapped out and operated upon, here the surgical vitrines gather up all the instruments that imagine the human physical body as a mechanical assemblage composed of parts like an engine that when a part is diseased or pathologized in some way, it's simply cut out. The part is cut out, removed, spliced, and new parts are put in, exactly on the model of an engineer's machine. This is the apotheosis of his works, of his animal vitrines, that is done here in the mid-90s, some comfort gained from the acceptance of the inherent lies in everything, in which he has taken the bodies of a cow and a bull, and he has spliced them together and interfiled them. And once again, this implies the same ontological world horizon as the surgical vitrines, in which the animal can be dissected by the gaze of science, opened up, spliced, hybridized, genetically modified, and so forth. And in the same way, the human being is looked at in exactly the same light. And so the work implies now, note this, that there is no longer an ontological distinction whatsoever in the scientific worldview between the human and the animal. Forget Heidegger's insistence on the abyss of difference that separates the human from the animal. And just as Heidegger had insisted that the problem with globalization is that it makes the near far and the far near and effaces and erases all distinctions between this place being more important, let's say as a site of a religious theophany, than that place over there. So too now, vertically speaking, along the great chain of being, there is now no longer any ontological difference in the scientific worldview between the human and the animal, since both are made of the same biological, biochemical, mechanical stuff, all of which can be interoperated upon, hybridized, spliced, changed, and so forth in exactly the same manner. And so the centuries in which it took religious evolution to pull the human from out of its animal substratum, if we think of the Sphinx, let's say, where the entire body is an animal but only the head is human, in contrast with the Greeks. By the time we get to the Greeks, we have with the centaur, we have a human body all the way down to the hips, and then an animal takes over from that point. And then by the time we get down to the Christians, all such half-human, half-animal visions are regarded as religious atavisms that are out of date. By the time of Christianity, we can see that there has been a long evolution of extraction of the human from the animal. The animal is pushed further and further and recedes further and further into the ontological background, while the human comes more and more to the fore in the creation of the humanistic tradition. And so since as far as the world gaze and the transcendental schema of late capitalism to wed with the big business industry of science is concerned, there is no such ontological difference between the human and the animal. Hirst goes ahead and in his 12 Disciples of 1994, represents the 12 disciples as having the heads of sheep. Basically, for each one of them, he's got a different sheep's head. He may as well represent the 12 disciples as though they were animals, since there is indeed no difference between them. They're essentially the same thing. The apostles can be represented in exactly the same way. So that wraps up the first phase of Hirst's career. Along about 1997, there's a caesura in his work, during which time he is concerned with buying a restaurant called Pharmacy, named after one of his earlier installations. He runs that restaurant for a while, and his art begins to splutter out and die for a couple of years. He was by then the most famous artist on the planet, just about, and you can see him wrestling in his interviews at the time with his fame, and he wasn't sure what to do or which direction to go next. But long about 1999, he starts getting going again with works. This is from that year. This is Adam and Eve, Banished from the Garden, 1999, in which he has put two corpses on gurneys, just like the two separate vitrines that he had started out with in 1,000 years. Now he has two vitrines connected together with two bodies, presumably. This is a male and a female, Adam and Eve. Note that what begins to happen now is that religious signifiers begin more and more to creep into the work, and they become hybridized and cross-spliced at first with the linguistic titles. They only appear at the linguistic level for a while with the titles. Eventually they're going to creep in the religious signifiers are going to creep into the images themselves, but at first they appear only in the titles, like in this case, Adam and Eve. The first two seeds, like the flies that crawl out of the cow's head in 1,000 years, the first two seeds of the human swarm that eventually at the apocalypse will also be the first two individuals resurrected. It's a good way to re-begin his work. This is him from 1999, which now is a bronze monumentalization of the little anatomical sculpture that we saw in one of his early medicine cabinets in the corner there. This is simply a large-scale version of that. But it has a religious title. Note that the hymn of the title refers, it sounds like a religious prayer book. Then we also have another work with a religious title, Trinity, Pharmacology, Physiology, Pathology. Trinity suggests, of course, the Christian Trinity, in which we have essentially the missing half of the medicine cabinets. These are the parts, anatomically speaking, of the various aspects of the human physical body that the various medicines in the medicine cabinets had been directed, that were basically the pharmacons that were directed toward. So we're provided with the sort of missing half of that. Then with Virgin Mother of 2005, we have one of contemporary art's most famous works. In this case, this is based on a Degas sculpture of a dancer. Hirst has monumentalized that and cross-spliced it. He does a lot of splicing and hybridizing of signifiers in his work with the anatomical model. And now in the title, linguistically, he has spliced in the signifier of the motif from ancient myth of the Virgin Mother, who is spread all throughout myth. It's not just a Christian myth. The mother who is about to give birth to a god. We don't know what the god is going to be that she's going to give birth to here. But the emphasis is on the hybridization and the cross-splicing of the signifiers. That anatomical motif begins to appear in works also like this one, Anatomy of an Angel, which has the anatomical motif opened up so the angel's body is treated as though it were a physical, living, real thing made out of physical matter rather than subtle matter. And with his two recent works from 2010 and 2011, Myth and Legend, which are giant horses, one with wings and the other is a unicorn, both from ancient myth. Both are sliced open and we're given an anatomical view, which is, of course, an updating of the ancient shamanistic X-ray art style, but it's reterritorialized now within the world of hypercapitalism and the gaze of big science. But long about 2005 now, the religious signifiers begin to infect the images themselves, no longer just the titles, but actually the works themselves are composed of hybridized signifiers from the world's religious traditions, especially the Catholic tradition that Hirst was raised in. This is the inescapable truth, which shows the descent of the dove, which was a signifier for the Holy Spirit, descending down toward a human skull. Normally this motif is traditionally represented with the baptism of Christ, who is always shown in the river being baptized by John, and the Holy Spirit is shown descending in a dove, in the form of a dove that's about to land upon him or enter into him. But here we have it entering into a skull. Now the skull in the Christian tradition, on the other hand, was normally associated with Adam. Sometimes you see the skull of Adam represented at the foot of the cross, and the cross is the sort of, Christ was the second Adam, so the dead Adam becomes then the seed from out of which the tree of the cross grows and produces the fruit of Christ as the second Adam. But here he spliced together the two images to create a new set of signifiers. He's done the same thing here with this one, the Sacred Heart of Jesus 2005, where he's shown a heart that has pins and needles and razor blades spliced into it that evokes the myth of the Saint Sebastian, who was killed in a barrage of arrows that were hurled at him by Roman soldiers. But that was never done to Christ, and this is actually a bull's heart. Christ did not have a bull's heart, neither did Saint Sebastian, but it does evoke the myth of the ancient sacrifice of the bull, which is a worldwide myth, it's ubiquitous. So once again, he's cross-splicing signifiers from the world's great religious traditions. This is Saint Bartholomew from 2007, who is the patron saint of medicine, and he was flayed. Here Hirst represents him with flayed skin. There's a gold counterpart to this as well. What Hirst is doing then, and it's very interesting because whereas in Hirst phase 1, during the first part of his career, he had basically given us the ontologically deworlded entity of science, and that included human as well as animal entities that are pure figure minus the ground of their originating worlds. And because they didn't have their originating worlds protecting them, nourishing them, and so forth, they simply had Father Science rather than Mother Earth to interact with them, cut them apart, and turn them into modular entities like moving furniture around in a Japanese house, modular units and entities. Whereas in Hurst Phase 2 now, we have the same thing, only now with religious signifiers. The religious signifiers have too also been deworlded. They've been ontologically deworlded like the entities of Hurst Phase 1 and removed from the originating conditions of their life worlds, their religious life worlds. And he has put them together and hybridized them as the equivalent, basically, of genetically modified organisms. His religious images are the equivalent of, they're basically religious GMOs, genetically modified, spliced together, hybridized religious images that create entirely new signifiers for which the signifieds now are missing. So the signifieds of his religious works have to be supplied by the viewer now. They are not predetermined, they're not pre-given in advance. Hurst may not even know what the signifieds are. He leaves that up to the viewer. In the age of contemporary art, we simply have the quest for new signifieds. The viewer comes in and tries to supply the signifieds to these new religious images, however he or she thinks that they should fit, and Hurst simply cross-splices and fertilizes these religious signifiers and hands them to the viewer in such a way as to give them, the viewer, the tools to create new signifieds. And so, unlike in the ancient world, where in the medieval ages you're pre-given meaning in advance, the Last Supper and the baptism of Christ mean just that. Their meanings, the signifieds that they refer to, have already been given to the viewer. There's no flexibility for the viewer's interpretation of those images. And even in modernist art, the flexibility of the interpretation is a bit limited. It's considerably more fluid than it was during the medieval period, but it is considerably limited by the fact that in modernist art, everyone is essentially doing the same thing. That is to say, they're creating the hyperdimensional object, the aperspectival world interior. They're all working with that in one way or another. But in contemporary art, all the transcendental signifieds are missing. And so there's a desperate quest for meaning amongst them. And I think this separates Hurst out from the other YBAs who mock the very process of looking for new signifieds. They simply, the rest of them seem to just simply give up in despair and mock the art process and its quest for new meanings. Hurst didn't do that. He has not done that. He is, I think his quest is an honest one. Unlike the art critic Robert Hughes, who has dismissed him, I think his work should not be dismissed. It's authentic. He's looking for new signifieds. And he's cross-splicing these works in an attempt to find new meaning in the world of global hypercapitalism. Some of this will have implications for Anish Kapoor, whom we'll look at next as another great British artist, one who is not connected with the YBAs at all, but who is another great British artist. So we'll look at him next.